Bonjour à tous et à tous. Bienvenue à cette discussion organisée dans le cadre de la 23e édition des RIDM, qui se déroule actuellement en ligne jusqu'au 2 décembre. Mon nom est Maude Matton et je suis programmateur au festival. La discussion qui va suivre va porter sur les films Une image, deux actes et The Names Have Changed, Including My Own, and Truths Have Been Altered, présentés dans le cadre de la section Confronter l'histoire du 12 au 18 novembre. Comme la discussion va se dérouler en anglais, permettez-moi de changer de langue pour introduire nos invités. It's my great pleasure to be discussing today with Sanaz Sohrabi, the director of One Image, Two Acts. Hi, Sanaz.
Hi, Maude.
As well as Onyeka Igwe, the director of The Names Have Changed, Including My Own, and Truths Have Been Altered. Welcome, Onyeka.
Hi.
I'm really excited to be here with both of you. And I would like to start this discussion by inviting you each to describe your film, and then for people at home who have not seen them yet, and then we will watch a trailer or excerpt from your films. So Sanaz, do you want to start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be in a conversation with you and Onyeka. One Image, Two Acts, یک تصویر دو برداشت, is an essay film that revolves around the colonial legacies of British petroleum in Iran and the establishment and development of Iranian industrial oil complex at large in the onset of 21st century. The film particularly focuses on the British Petroleum Archive, the photograph and films, and follows the system of representation within the archives, issues of accessibility, and follows that visual regimes of representation onward to the nationalization and decolonization movement and the Iranian New Wave cinema as a sort of like counter narrative. The film was developed over a course of 3 years and of archival research and investigation, field work and whatnot. And I presented the work in a multitude of different ways in terms of like writing and, sketches of the excerpts and the archival material. And then it developed, through conversations with a lot of friends and to arrive at what it is now that I'm really happy to be sharing with everyone also at RIDM.
Thank you. And let's watch a trailer.
آرشیو به مکان یک اتفاق با تأخیر و خواننده آرشیو به ناظری بی مکان و ناخوانده تبدیل می شود. بیننده که به دنبال چهره آشنا می گردد یا رام کردن یک داستان. گویی مخاطب نیز داخل تصویر است. از میان می شکافد. حواس تشخیصمان را منتشر و پیمایش می کند. با فاصله از نزدیک. فاصله مجموعی است از وقفه های در حرکت.
And now, Onyeka, can you introduce your film?
Sure, yeah, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, and I'm really looking forward to being in conversation with you. So the film, with a very long and kind of inconvenient title, The Names Have Changed, Including My Own, and Truths Have Been Altered, it's looking at the same story told in a few different ways, using like several different narrative devices and from different perspectives. So it's the story of my grandfather told through one of the first books published in Igbo, called Onyeka, through a Nollywood film, through conversations with my father, through diary entries, and through the kind of oral histories of my family, and then also through colonial moving images. So yeah, it's trying to think about how knowledge is produced of the past of particular places.
Thank you. And now let's watch an excerpt.
The 7th of December. I don't know that many stories from my father's side of the family, but I did know one that my mother told me. That my grandfather was a good man, a big man, well respected because he had hidden slaves. Saved them. I had conjured in my imagination a big wooden trunk, camouflaged by wet darkness, that was full of people evading slavers. I even told this to people as I got older, proud of my ancestry. I read it almost a year after buying it, reading through my fingers, not wanting the titular character who sells his workers into slavery after he had lost all of his goods in the lake to be my grandfather. I was relieved when my grandfather appeared as a sidekick, as the one that would help Onyeka reconcile his past doings with the land, with the earth goddess. A bull, 8 eggs, a cock, 8 big yams, and 8 small yams. I wondered what you could make with that.
So for people who have not seen the films yet, the films have some similarities and themes that connect with each other, but they're also super different in their topics, their form, their approach. But there is one similarities between the two films, and is your personal connection to the stories you're telling, and also that connection being partly through your grandfathers. And I was wondering, you know, you each explore super different like histories and, you know, very complex topics, but at the same time it comes from there's personal connections in there. And I was wondering if you wanted to talk about your starting point in making the film and how things unfolded, right? So like how, you know, was it through your grandfather, or was there something else, and then that connection was very obvious and needed to be in the film? Yeah, I'd be really interested in hearing you both about, you know, how your films unfolded and that exploration happened.
I can go. Yeah, so I guess I've been like researching British colonial film archives for a few years. And so I've been like going to different archive places in the UK and looking at the archives there, and I've been making work based on that. And I was interested, I guess this project started because I decided to go to Nigeria and visit the archives there. And it was kind of the first time that I've been to Nigeria by myself without my parents. And so I was kind of taking the opportunity to explore it through a different kind of perspective. And that was kind of my way in, and the film is kind of based on that, really on that kind of encounter with Nigeria and thinking through the idea of what archives might mean there. But this kind of story about my grandfather is a story that's existed, that I've known for a really, really long time. But I guess, I mean, that kind of idea of thinking about this research through the perspective of my own engagement with the place in which, like, I'm from, but don't live in and haven't lived in, and that my parents and my family are from, kind of, I guess, necessitated an engagement that was on like a familial level. So my grandfather kind of came in because I was thinking about my family, I was thinking about where I was from, I was thinking about like the land. And so all of these things kind of brought me to this kind of story, which is in some way like this origin story that I've always known of, but have known in its partial way. So I was interested in trying to dig a little bit deeper and find out more about that story. And yeah, that kind of structured the film that I ended up making.
Yeah, so it's really nice to hear the story, Onyeka. Thank you. One Image, Two Acts is part of a larger research project. And so in that way, it is one of the sort of research outcomes, if you will, of the project. And I've also been working with the British Petroleum Archives for quite some time. And I started with the archive actually, and later arrived at my family. So, it was, it was I was really hesitant at first to really had a hard time, and I was struggling with the writing, because I felt that I was so engulfed with this colonial archives that I felt that they had the upper hand, right? So it took me some years actually to be able to create a narrative hook and to really tame these materials, and to find an angle, because these colonial materials are so they're tailored and curated in a way that they're so pristine and they're so sanitized. In order for you to find an angle to approach them, it really takes some time to really find that narrative window. And for me, it arrived much later toward the end of the project that I realized that there was a story that I just wasn't able to see it, because I felt that the colonial archives and the photographs had such power over what I could see and what I could desire and what I could form the story out of them. And I think I tried to incorporate that into the story, also into the narrative of the film, about the power relationship within the archives, about that seeing them was not, and accessing them was not as easy for me. I had to go through, I wasn't even sure if I could get to the UK to begin with. My passport almost got lost into the visa process. It was the whole crazy system back in 2019. So, there was this whole issue that I wanted to make it visible into the story as well, that seeing them and having access to them was a whole process of its own. And I tried to incorporate that also through the oral history and sort of, family stories. But at the same time, even that part, I wanted to become not the main story itself also. Like, everything is very fragmented. Even the stories that are being told, family stories, are also fragmented. So, and I hope that the narrative structure will speak to the formation of these archives also. And yeah, so, and the other thing that I wanted to also mention was that, the site visit itself, because I couldn't film inside the archive, I was super interested to do that. I thought about maybe this also would be about like expanding what an archive is, like, if it's a site, it's it could be a collection of images, it could be the office of the archive, it could be a monument, it could be a museum. I've always sort of like been engaged with expanding what an archive is and what it could be, or it could be stories and voices as well. So that's also one thing that came up throughout the research process and the writing of the film.
Yeah, and yeah, it's something you definitely address in your film with, your issue accessing the archive. And I think for both of you, it's like, colonial archives that should not belong to colonial powers, right? It's like you can't access them in ways that, because archives are so controlled. There's this whole question of like the question of rights of access to archives and who are the archives for. And both of your films like deal with the archival material and other found footage for you, Onyeka, like different footage in like super creative ways. You really make it dynamic, and you also like actively interact and transform the archives, which, they're both such interesting films in that way. And I was wondering, I would like to start by maybe showing 2 excerpts from your film so people can have a sense of how some of the ways you've done that.
کوه بعد از کوه، خط بعد از خط، فریم بعد از فریم. فضا به مکان تبدیل شد و کوه‌ها به تصاویر از بالا گرفته شده. مانند حفاری زمین، عکاسی هم ابزار کنترل قدرت شد. چگونه میتوان در میان سیل این تصاویر دیدن را کنار گذاشت؟ آیا این تصاویر داستانگویان معتبری هستند؟
It's a silent film, so it starts with a title card that says Jekyll House, Lagos, 1927. A freight train. There's a wide shot of a freight train. There are several bricks piled up on it. The train stops and a line of 8 men go to pick up the bricks. The camera moves across as they travel down the path. A white man looks on at what they're doing. Then there's a close up of steam coming out of the train. The scene cuts. The next scene opens with the train coming into the station.
So one thing I wanted to ask you in relation to the archives was how much transformation did you have to do in order to be able to present the archives, like legally, to, because there's definitely sometimes in order to legally be able to present archives, you have to transform them. And you both transformed the archives in really creative ways. And I was wondering how much of it was your own process of transforming it for your own narratives, and how much of it was, restraints that you had in order to actually be able to show the archive, and then finding creative ways to do that.
I think that it was really interesting what Sanaz was saying about the kind of power, or the overwhelming kind of how the colonial archive can overwhelm, and the narrative and the kind of racial ideologies that it holds are really quite strong and are reproduced continually to this day. So I think the kind of, whenever I'm using archive material, I'm thinking quite a lot about that and what I can do to in some way cut through or intersect. And I kind of noticed some similarities in our 2 approaches. This idea of touching the material was something that recurred, and I guess there's something about me, something about an attempt to be close to the material and take it away from this kind of distant gaze and bring it closer. So that's something that I think about doing quite a lot. And I guess I didn't really think that I was hamstrung by legalities in terms of transforming the material. I think it was more I was interested in, especially with the archive film from the British Colonial Archive film, I wanted it to use it to tell a different story. So what would it mean to put it against this kind of folk tale? So that was kind of the intention of a transformation I mean, I attempted in other works of like really working with the material. So with this one, it was simply, what does it mean to kind of change the narrative of these films and get them to tell a story that they weren't intended to tell, and that they, in their kind of construction, kind of not permit, they don't permit the possibility of these stories in their construction. So what does it mean to like inject them with that? So yeah, that's what I think I was like thinking through.
Regarding the transformation of the archive, for me, it was more about the process that I was working in the studio with the material, and a lot of them happened actually by chance. So I didn't really think about like legality issues, because I had received the permission to use them and whatnot. So it wasn't really about that, but it was more about really taking the images out of their two-dimensional frame and then print them, reprint them, film them, and like I wanted to layer that act of viewing. And I do that often in my work in general. I'm always blowing images up, cutting them and refilming them, and I think they sort of like unleash certain sort of like ghosts and stories that are invisible otherwise. And I really enjoy that process as well. And a lot of the things that you see in the film, like the layering, and it happened quite chanceful at an artist residency, when artist residencies were practical before COVID. And really it happened like through the process, and I was like, oh, this is actually kind of nice, and I incorporated, refilmed them, and repeated that. So for me, it is about really playing with the image, so it comes out of that two-dimensional play frame. And so so we are kind of like we are more confronted with not only what is inside the frame, right, but also we may be engaged with what was left outside and sort of remained invisible in some ways. So yeah, and I tried to pay attention to not only the image, but also the way it is viewed and projected, how it's held, how it's blown up, how it's out of the scale. I think it's really interesting when the images lose their quality. I'm really interested in that. And it also comes in my background in like photography. Like I come through filmmaking from a photography background, so I'm always really aware like of the image is not something that is framed and put on the wall. It's I like to entangle the image into the storytelling in more creative ways that really speaks to conditions of visuality within the image. So in that sense, it was just process oriented in some ways through the studio work and really printing the materials and playing around with them.
Thank you. Do you have questions you would like to ask each other? You've both seen each other's films before this conversation. I was wondering if there was anything you were really curious about or wanted to specifically discuss with each other. I want to give you space for that too.
I mean, I was curious about what the kind of the voiceover and what you were thinking about in that construction, and what kind of voice you were kind of. It's like interesting speaking to you now because like the differences in, like I'm just curious about the process of like writing the voiceover and performing the voice as well.
Yeah. So regarding the writing, I was struggling out with the writing, and it went through so many different versions. And I remember one day I just sat down at like a dinner table, and I just wrote it all down in like half a day of it was just like, and I was so frustrated because I had all these like notes on the wall, and I felt that I could never like pull it all together. And so it was it was really fragmentary. So I had like different paragraphs that I had developed through like different workshops. Like I was presenting the research at like a seminar or a conference, and there was like a line that I liked that I incorporated in that research presentation, and I had that in mind, but I didn't know how to put it. So I pulled in all those pieces together to form the structure. So, but in terms of like the positionality of the voiceover, from the beginning, I knew that it's gonna be not only my voice is gonna be like my uncle and one of his friends that he actually passed away throughout the process of the film, and that he was an oil worker in the company, and he has super interesting stories. But actually, they didn't make it to the film, to this version. Hopefully, in other projects. So I knew that it's not going to be only me. It's going to be other voices, other stories. And there is sort of conversation, and so I knew that I wanted to be present, but also I wanted to go in and out and decenter myself throughout the narrative, and also I was trying to throughout the writing. Also, I wanted to point out the ways in which, as a reader of the archive, of someone who you are working with, you are a voyeurist, right? Nonetheless, you are positioned in a way to look at what was written before, what was curated there before. So it was. I wanted to create an opportunity to make that also part of the story, the voyeurism of working with this archival material, and that was really important for me, actually. So that was one thing that I knew throughout the whole process that I'm gonna incorporate. I wasn't really sure how to write it down, but hopefully, I was able to do so, to point the finger at the archive, also like work the archive against itself in some ways. And so I hope that I was able to do that, to really bring that fragmentary nature of the writing process itself, because it was a process of 3 years. So I had lines that were from the start of the project in 2017. There were lines that they happened like right at the end when I was doing the post-production. So I really wanted to show that it was a research process, and this is part of that as well.
Yeah, I think the thing about the voyeur I find is really interesting, because I can't help but think that whenever I go to the archive, I am performing the function that the archive is kind of there for, and what was created for. And then, I get kind of excited at little bits that you discover, and then you're just like, oh, I'm just falling into these kind of traps. And so, I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, the other, this act of recovering the voice of the subaltern, and what is invisible and what is unwritten. What was it unwritten because no one knew about it? What was it unwritten because it was meant to be unwritten? So there are all these different ways of negation, these ways of inaccessibility or invisibility that once you're recovering, you really have to constantly navigate these notions. And I think I wanted to incorporate your work also into it, because I think you through this way of writing that is, it's like a diary, right? There's dates, and there's it points at almost it's calendrical, right? You're writing things down to give it some weight of place, of time, so I think that was something that was interesting for me. And the other thing was also, again, wanted to mention about the inclusion of myths and magical stories that they're often not part of the official archives, right? So I think that was for me the overarching sort of theme that I encountered while I was watching your film, was that this is about inclusion of these stories and myths and figures that they are completely out of the official archive. They're not part of these system of identification. They're not part of the ways in which the colonial and imperial archive are meant to be technologies of identification, classification, systematic ordering of things. So I really enjoyed that, and I think that was a really smart way to sort of incorporate that into the work. And the other thing I wanted to ask you was that the time frame of the project, because you mentioned that you've been working with these colonial archives, and how did this project come through, and sort of like tell us a little bit about how you went to Nigeria. How did you, like the time frame of like working with archives, site visits, and field works?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's interesting thing about the calendar or the diary, because before I went to Nigeria, I went to like the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and was like just looking at I was like, oh, I want to read like people's like personal papers, like colonialists and people who worked for the state. And I was like reading these diaries, and they were so boring. And I was like, wow, imagine like having the temerity to think that I should donate these to Oxford Library because people will be interested in reading them. I was like, this is terrible. And so I was like, oh, okay, what if I like, had the audacity to think that of the possibility of my diary being like, like being an archive object, what would people find, and how mundane could it possibly be? So yeah, and that kind of leads on to what you were saying about inclusion. I was like interested in putting the archive next to lots of different ways of approaching knowledge or approaching history, and trying to like equal the playing field by like putting them all together and seeing what happened. In terms of like, so I guess I've been doing this research since 2016 in like the colonial film unit, which was the British government's like colonial propaganda media machine. So yeah, I've been looking into it since 2016, and I made this trip to Nigeria at the end of 2018. And was there for like 2 months pretty much, visiting like archives in Lagos, in the East and in the North as well, and was like filming and kind of writing along the way. And then I was doing a residency as well actually in Athens in 2019, and spent that time like making the film, I would say, because it was like the construction was completely in the edit, because I didn't really have so much of an idea about what I was really doing when I was in Nigeria. I was just like, oh, I'm just gonna like experience it and see kind of what comes. And then I had all this material and all the ways that I'd been thinking before about it. And then like the kind of scene that is like the kind of gesture movement thing happened like really just at the end. Like I think I filmed it in June and I finished the film in August. So it was like really, I was editing, I was like, oh, there's something that's missing, there's like another element. And so that came really late. So yeah, I guess it's kind of, in a way, it felt very much like the culmination of like this research. Because I think it kind of, I've been thinking about working with the archive in a way that kind of approached all the strategies that you were talking about, but kind of foregrounded my like presence, my interaction and my subjectivity. And so it felt like, yeah, that the film kind of does all of that in a quite holistic way. So yeah, I guess it's like it was like 3 years in the making, and like, but the actual production was like a year or something.
Yeah, about the same time. Mine was also, I started in 2017, and it 3 years of production. But it's interesting because I actually totally relate to this like last minute inclusions of the film they just fit so perfectly, as if like they were totally meant to be, but they never even like occurred to you throughout the whole process. So that's the fun part when you're in post-production and just like include something and it just like is meant to be.
Yeah, that's my favorite part.
Yeah.
It's stressful, but it's good.
But also, I totally relate to the way you were sort of filming. You know, it's I have like this ongoing like personal index of, you know, I always film wherever I go for residencies and whatnot. So, and they always, part of it end up in the film later on, even if it wasn't like really, so I really enjoyed that, like, process, that is always mixed it through this sort of like artist film, and that is like process, that's research as film. So I really enjoyed that, and I found it really familiar in a way, both in terms of the writing, but also in terms of the inclusion of these visual materials, the shots that were taken. So I really enjoyed that because it's something I'm really familiar with. It's how I operate, and I'm really glad that I was able to watch the film.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. Sanaz, I wanted to ask you if you wanted to talk a bit more about the cinemas in your film, because maybe I will let you just share what you want with people who haven't seen the film yet, so that But yeah, like the sites of cinemas as holding so many different meanings, and yeah, I think it's really interesting how you address that, and then how you address that through film also.
The question on cinemas, I have to start with sort of like going back how the film started, or the research for the film started. Back in 2017, I read this essay by Maude, who's a film scholar, and whose scholarship is all about petrofilms, or prestige films by the oil companies, that were used as company propaganda for different communication purposes, for advertising their operations, for gathering investments and whatnot. And they also somehow would end up in different film festivals in Europe as just films, documentary films and surveys and whatnot. So I was really taken away by this whole petrofilms and prestige films. So that was the sort of like the departure for me to know about these films. And then from there, I went to the archive, and the rest sort of like is the story of the project. But the film itself, and sort of like the media infrastructure, the visual infrastructure, of which the archive is a part, became really important for me. And the other aspect was the cinemas itself as sites, and as built environment, as architectures, as sort of like urban elements, as elements with which different classes of the oil company would be classified based on the cinemas that they were going to, because cinemas were also segregated. So the higher rank staff had a different cinema, the lower rank staff had different cinemas, and also different ethnicities and whatnot. So the cinema became something else, right? The cinema was not only a site, but also it was like an emblem. This was a symbol of the colonial sort of presence. And the other thing I was really fascinated by was that, like Amir Naderi, for instance, who is an incredible director, he's from Abadan, and he tells a story that he went to a lot of the cinemas of the oil company, and saw a lot of movies, many of which were in English, so he wouldn't understand it, but he would watch the films nonetheless, and that had an influence in his cinema later on. So there was different ways that I was really drawn to incorporating cinema into the story, both as an emblem of the colonial presence, but also as the site, as a built environment, and also how it became the site of a struggle as well. And there was another moment that was really important also. Another film scholar, Sarah Saljuqi, she came to for a talk at Concordia, and she presented this film called Flames and Flames. And that film is particularly about the cinemas that they were set on fire before the 1979 revolution, for different reasons. But again, part of it was, for a collective anger, in a way, that found its way in the cinematic space. And I already had this photographs from the archive from the riots that had taken place in 1951 at Taj Cinema. So that sort of like triggered for me that to really incorporate those images also in the story and try to connect that as another thread into really pulling the image economy that was sort of like started and propelled by the oil company and the British into another site, right? Because it is about the ways in which these images migrated and moved, right? They were transformed, right? And the cinema played a really important role, right? They ran a new wave, became a site of like counter narrative, but in itself had different dynamics, right? Like Golestan himself was really criticized by a lot of his fellow filmmakers for being a sellout in some ways, because he would constantly make these commission films for the oil company post-nationalization. He was really critical for being really separated from like the oppressed, from like the subordinated working class and the oil workers, right? So in itself, I think They Run in a Wave also has different dynamics, and it's not really as straightforward like the side of like anti-colonial struggle and whatnot, but it is definitely there. It is a counter narrative, it is a counter history, but it is interesting for me to follow that image economy, how it moved and how it was transformed. And in my work, I also in the broader research, I look at other filmmakers, Iranian filmmakers, that they either are from Southwest, or they've been making films around the oil infrastructures and oil industry and the urban elements and urban formations of the oil towns.
Thank you. It's such a interesting complex history that I feel your film, begins to dig in, and there's just so much that it leaves wanting to learn more about. I would maybe end this discussion by asking Onyeka a question about the dualisms in your film. I think it's such an interesting symbolism because your film is so complex and non-linear. Like you really tell a story to as many ways as possible, and so in that way there's not two lines going through the film, but then at the same time there's this imagery of the twins which comes back in your performance, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk a bit more about the symbolism of the twins for you and why that was something very that meant a lot to your film.
It's funny, like I think before like this line, there were two brothers, kind of came to me, so I don't know, before I even thought about making this film, I just like wrote a really short story that was about these two brothers, and I just kind of like left it. And then when I was asking my mum more questions about my grandfather, there emerged this kind of dynamic between my great grandfather and my grandfather had some kind of like relationship and like friendship, and like their story kind of had there was like this duality in their story that really mapped onto this story that I just kind of thought about of these two brothers. And I mean, it's kind of funny because I would say that I guess with the work, like it's about resisting a kind of binary, and I wouldn't say that I'm like that interested in binaries so much anyway, but this kind of dualism kind of like emerged and kept on being repeated, and in like kind of like happenstance kind of ways, like it works in the same way for like the film reels as well. And then when I was like figuring out how to work with a performer, it turned out that the person that I had seen performing something else, Titileo, I was like, oh yeah, we kind of like are an odd twin kind of duo, and I wasn't supposed to be in it myself originally, and then I was like, oh, actually this works to like reinforce this idea of a kind of dualism or like twins, and then twins have like significance in Nigerian culture in different communities as well. They mean different things in different places. So I guess I wanted to keep that kind of that motif of these two because it appeared in lots of different ways, and I don't necessarily have like an intention or like a meaning that I want to assign to it, but it just kept on recurring, and I guess I wanted to hold on to that kind of alchemy, or that thing that you can't really explain, that just like kind of just exists and is coming out. So yeah, there's not really an intention behind it, but it's more something that just kept on happening, and so I guess is in some way important, but I don't quite know now what it is, but I'm sure I'll figure it out, or it'll be revealed to me some point soon.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting talking with you both, and I'm really glad that you accepted to have this discussion together. Yeah, so thank you again, Onyeka and Sanaz. And as a reminder, the films are available on our platform enligne.ridm.ca from November 12th to November 18th. Donc, j'ai remercié les cinéastes et pour rappel, les films sont disponibles sur notre plateforme enligne.ridm.ca du 12 au 18 novembre. Merci encore et bon festival.